I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to this emerging course on Agrippa. I say emerging because I don't know how long it's going to last. I hope it's not going to last the rest of the year, but it could. That's conceived, but totally possible, given just how complex all this is going to get. But we're picking back up this time in lecture 2, where we're going to continue sort of following Agrippa in his life and times, and we're going to get some sense of what he's going to be writing and that. But the main thrust of what we've covered so far is sort of what I would call the juvenile Agrippa. This is Agrippa up to the time he leaves to go to Italy, and it's going to be really in Italy that Agrippa is going to come into his own as a thinker, as a hermeticist, as a Kabbalist, especially, and really, in some sense, it's going to be all of those strands that come together: magic, hermeticism, Kabbalah. It's really going to be those that come together to form modern occultism as we would recognize it and as we know it, and those really come together in the vector that is Cornelius Agrippa, and so the most important thing, I guess, to point out at this point is that Agrippa is already a practicing occultist, or he's working in the world of occult philosophy already by the time he leaves to go to Italy. He's part of this so-called Agrippa Circle, which is a group of like-minded occultists who are studying Hermeticism and Kabbalah, which are emerging at this time. By 1510, he's already produced the juvenile draft of the 3 books of occult philosophy. So by the time that he even gets to Italy, he's already produced in some sense his magnum opus. Now, of course, it's going to be greatly expanded when it is ultimately published 23 years later in 1533. But Agrippa is already kind of, in some sense, mature as much as one could be in terms of thinking about the occult philosophy this time. But this is only going to deepen as he transitions into Italy. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about his transition here into Italy. Now, it's really important to note, right? This is around 1511. He shows up in Italy, and what's crucial to know about this is that this is in some sense ground zero. Italy, especially Florence, is ground zero for this new emergence of Plato, of Neoplatonism, of Hermeticism, and Kabbalah. So all of those, right, all 4 of those are really sort of ground zeroed in Florence in the circles in the generation that followed from Ficino and from Pico. And so, in many ways, if you really want to get knee deep in the emerging occult philosophy, as much as it was a unified philosophy, it really wasn't. But as much as you want to get into that world, Italy is the place you want to go. And it's serendipitous, of course, that Agrippa is going to end up in Italy. Now, of course, he's sent there not because he's trying to learn occult philosophy. He's sent there basically as a diplomat working on the behalf of Maximilian, the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. So he's sent there to work on that. But of course, as an additional thing, he's going to be studying the occult philosophy in and around Italy, and he moves constantly through Italy. So he's moving around there in different cities all the time, and it allows him to make contact with lots of different people functioning there. So again, he's functioning here as a diplomat. Basically, you'll remember that Italy at this point is not unified. It won't be unified for hundreds of more years, and that what you really have is a bunch of warring city-states, along with the Papal States, and France is actively engaged in invading northern Italy at this time. So you have a really complex political and military situation that is going on in early 15th century, or early 16th century Italy. And again, this is the world of Machiavelli and stuff like that, if you want to sort of get an idea of what's going on there. Um, but the main thing to know at this point is that Agrippa is going to land in Italy, and he's going to be invited to give lectures. And one of the more important lectures he's going to be giving is on the Hermetic Pymander that he gives in Pavia. Some of that survives. We're going to be talking about that in the next couple of lectures. We're going to be talking about some of these works of Agrippa that aren't the three books of occult philosophy, but we do have a fragment of one of the lectures he gave at Pavia on the Corpus Hermeticum. So, or at least the first logos of the Corpus Hermeticum 1. Um, it's also worth pointing out he uh, tends toward the Lazzarelli translation as opposed to the much deficient Ficino translation, which we can talk about later. He also marries an Italian woman at this time, so we know that he gets married and he has a son in 1517. And he's in contact constantly with the main movers and shakers of this sort of Hermetic world. So he's lecturing on the Corpus Hermeticum. He is hanging out with Paulus Rhesius. You may know Rhesius primarily as a translator of Joseph Gicatilla's very important Kabbalistic book, Sha'are Ora, The Gates of Light. It's translated into Latin as the Gates of Light, as the Portae Lucis. And I'm sure most folks have seen the image. It's a very famous image of the frontispiece of the bearded man sitting down holding the tree of life with a spherote and the famous woodcut. That is from the Paulus Rhesius translation of the Sha'are Ora. And so this is a quintessentially important book of Kabbalah that's now made available to people like Agrippa. The two things he seems to be studying the most while he's in Italy are the two things that are making the biggest splash. That is Kabbalah, as I just mentioned, but also Hermeticism. So Hermeticism is also really getting its own wings. And you have to understand that Hermeticism in people like Ludovico Lazzarelli, this was a really a certain version of Hermetic Christianity was really formulating at this time, with even with sort of like semi-Hermetic kind of messianic figures like Mercurio, very strange figure, perhaps one of the strangest figures of the Renaissance, so unusual that historians didn't even think he was real until they found good evidence from other sources that he was in fact real. It was a bizarre situation of a kind of Hermetic um, rebirth of Hermes Trismegistus in a messianic kind of way. It was a very strange affair with Lazzarelli. Lazzarelli was quite taken with him. But at any rate, Hermeticism is really also getting its wings here. And again, Agrippa is very much in the midst of that. It's also worth pointing out here that in 1515, an incredibly important volume gets published by the press of Aldus Mantutius. You may know from my book collecting people out there, Aldus Mantutius is probably the most famous printer of the Renaissance. He is the most famous printer of the Renaissance. In some sense, the Renaissance rode on the wings of the editions of Aldus Mantutius. And in 1515, Mantutius is going to print off um, a um, a version of the Corpus Hermeticum that is attached to Iamblichus and attached to Proclus and several other texts of Ficino, and it's going to be bookended by the Corpus Hermeticum. And this volume, published in 1515, is in many ways the primary vector by which I think an entire generation of people came to the Hermetic philosophy, or sort of late pagan Neoplatonism and things like that, are through that volume. Agrippa lands basically right around the time that volume drops. And the intersection of the interest in sort of Hermeticism and late pagan Neoplatonism is really encapsulated in that one volume. I've done an episode about that volume, and it really encapsulates sort of what's going on at that time. So this is an incredibly important work being published. Yeah, it's going to be really important to the history development of all this material that we're talking about. It's also going to be during this time period that Agrippa will compose his other Neoplatonic and more Hermetic works, because again, he's swimming in that sea. And it's going to be those that are going to get published this time, especially texts like the Three Ways of Knowing God, which we'll talk about when we come back to Agrippa's specific works later on. But yeah, he also, like I said, he founds another, or is a member of another sort of Hermetic brotherhood of some kind of esoteric order at this time as well. And again, this seems to be sort of a mutual support society, much like the one that he had in France, but also it's bound up with studying these kinds of texts and this kinds of literature. This is the example of the Porte Lucas I was just telling you about. This is the translation made by Paulus Rhesius. Rhesius, as you folks may know, was a convert from Judaism to Catholicism, and he became a pretty rabid anti-Semite. But this is a famous example of using the weapons of the Jews against them, where they would translate these works of Kabbalah into Latin so they could be used as part of the sort of larger polemical process of basically trying to convert Jews using the Kabbalah. So Rhesius is a really famous example of this. His brother also published works, and Agrippa knew both of them. So Agrippa's working in these circles with literally with the people who are introducing Kabbalah in a big way into Europe for the first time. Of course, a generation prior to this would have been the translations of people like Flavius Mithridates and Johannan Alameno, both of whom were hired by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola to translate stuff he wanted to be translated from Hebrew into Latin. So really, it's an ongoing process of this sort of explosion of Kabbalistic ideas. Now, the main thrust of what's going on in Agrippa's thought as he develops it during the Italian period is, again, the sort of very strange idea, at least compared to his Catholicism, is that somehow ancient Hermetic and Kabbalistic wisdom are going to be central to the spiritual restoration of human beings. And carrying forward an idea already found in people like Ficino and Lodovico Lazzarelli, where one could use these primordial wisdoms as a way of reconciling oneself to God. Specifically, this is going to be the process of reconciling oneself via Hermetic ideas and Kabbalistic ideas. And that reconciliation is going to give one godlike powers. Because, in the same way that Adam had the ability to manipulate nature via miraculous causation, because this is pre-lapsarian, pre-fall Adam. Adam had these magical, miraculous abilities to manipulate nature. If you reconcile yourself to God, or if you become in the process of reconciling oneself to God, you would get similar kinds of powers. So magic here at this time period is in some sense a byproduct of that reconciliation. So as one is reconciled back to the divine, original sin is sort of washed off. And as original sin is washed off, so to speak, one would gain those prelapsarian powers over nature. And that is simply what Agrippa at this time, and many people this time, thought of as ultimately what's going to be magic. So that's magic in a sort of short sense of a definition of how one would get these sort of powers. Now, one of the things that's happened is that when the fall occurred, when the fall occurred, and this fall is of course brought on by Eve, and sort of the mythology that Agrippa develops. Eve represents wisdom, or reason rather. She represents sort of like dialectical reasoning. And she kind of infected Adam with this dialectical reasoning, this kind of logical reasoning, which he also associates, by the way, with scholasticism. This has made it such that human beings have tried to reason their way to the divine. Agrippa thinks that's not going to work. You can't reason your way back to the divine because the mind itself has somehow fallen. In fact, it's being diluted in some sense by reason itself. And so, what has to happen, and again, this is where the more Protestant side of Agrippa's thought pops out, is that the only way to restore that is through a type of faith, but a mystically informed faith that shorts that circuit. So you can't reason your way back to the divine, but what you can do is your mind can leap up to the divine, and it can sort of short the circuit between yourself and God. And that shorting of that circuit is achieved by a kind of mystical faith. And that mystical faith is encoded in, or the mechanisms by which to use that mystical faith are encoded in texts like the text of the Kabbalah and text of the Corpus Hermeticum. So the idea is the further we get back in time, the further we get access to technologies that allow us to reconcile ourselves to God, because people back then were just closer to the divine. The fall of human beings was simply closer to them, and therefore they weren't as fallen as we are now. And this idea of the essential aspect of faith, and really faith alone, by which one reconciles oneself to God, which again has this kind of Protestant bent to it in a certain kind of way, this is going to do two things for Agrippa. The one thing it's going to do, it's going to drive him increasingly in the direction of the skepticism that's going to be laid out in his most important philosophical text, De Incertitudine, on the doubtfulness of reason and science, art and science. That's going to lead him in a direction of kind of a skepticism, and that skepticism is something we'll talk about in a bit. But also, it's going to cause him to lean into the magic side of things, because again, the magic side of things, this sort of rational, not irrational, but non-rational mode of engaging with the divine, that is the mechanism by which one reconciles oneself to God. So notice here, we often think of Agrippa as being somewhat split-minded. His philosophy is being schizophrenic. It is of two minds. On the one hand, there's this skeptical dimension, but on the other hand, there's this magical dimension. But the truth of the matter is, they're perfectly in line with each other, because they have everything to do. They're all connected to the idea that what has to happen is a reconnection with the divine through a mystical act of faith. And it informs both, it underwrites both. So the first thing I want to point out here as we get into Agrippa's thought more and more deeply, that it seems to us that there's a contradiction in Agrippa's thought. I would argue it's not. It's actually part of a deeper harmony. And by exploring both directions, the magical direction and the skeptical direction, we'll realize those are actually much more harmonious than we think. And this again gives I think, shows at some level the old idea that the De Incertitudine was written as a cover story for the 3 books of occult philosophy. This is the idea put forward by Francis Yates and others. I think there's good reason to believe that's false. We'll come back to that more as we get into it. But what I want to point out here is, as early as the Italian period, some degree of skepticism and some degree of magic are reconciled in this fundamental unity in Agrippa's thought already at this time. And as I mentioned, right, Agrippa's reading a lot of Kabbalah at this time, again, in translation, but now he's reading it directly. Remember, primarily the text that he was reading, the central text that we know he had access to was Reuchlin's book, De Verba Mirifico, right? That text was his primary. He lectured on it in Dole in France, but that seems to be the primary text that he was working with. This would also be the time period where Reuchlin would write another book, De Arte Kabbalistica, which would be a much more exhaustive book on the Kabbalah, but also Agrippa is getting access to primary sources, at least in translation and into Latin. So that's going to be a big deal. And as we'll get to the 3 books of occult, what's going to matter in all that is that the main thing that's going to make this most substantial difference between the 1510 juvenile draft and the 1533 mature version is going to be the insertion of a lot more Kabbalah, especially in book 3. Another major book he's reading at this time is De Harmonia Mundi, which is another book that encapsulates a great deal of Neoplatonic philosophy. And that's also going to be incredibly important as we get into the text. In fact, he will quote De Harmonia Mundi over and over and over again, especially in book 2. You see it being quoted a lot. He never names the sources, but it's quoted pretty extensively, especially in book 2. So by 1517, the political and military tide would turn. There's a moment where the French government actually gets pretty close to where Agrippa is. They seize the town. Some of his manuscripts get seized. He's barely able to get them. Some of them he loses. The commentaries that he wrote on Paul are lost at this time. Agrippa seems to have been very covetous of those commentaries that he wrote on Paul. We don't know what was in them, but Agrippa, you see in his letters, he's constantly writing to his friends, being like, "Hey, can you get those for me?" And they fail to get them, and ultimately they're lost, unfortunately. So they were very important to him, which is all the more sad that we've lost them. But this period of time in Italy is crucial. It's crucial because this is where Agrippa really deepens his understanding of Hermeticism and especially of Kabbalah. And I think I've said this before, right? He famously says that while he was born in Germany, that he was educated in Italy. In fact, at the very beginning of the lecture he gives on the Hermetic Pymander, he says something like, "Even a barbarian like me, a barbarian from the north, can come down here among the Romans, the Italians, and even I have something of merit to say." So I love the idea that he thinks of himself as a Germanic barbarian coming into Rome, Italy, to lecture on the Hermetic Pymander. It's you get a sense of his humor. Martin Luther is going to star in the show in just a minute here. This is a really important part of the story as well, and we'll talk a little about the influence and how Agrippa is going to relate to the rise of Protestantism. Um, he's sent to Metz, and if you know your history of Protestantism, you'll know that that Metz is the one of the very important centers of the rise of early Protestantism, and this would put him really in the center of kind of the emergence of Protestantism. Now, at this point, it's not totally certain in the history of the development of the 1520s that Luther is not going to find a way to get reconciled back to the church. There's still a debate at this point about whether Luther is going to break away completely from the Catholic Church. And at this point, it doesn't seem like it could go either way. But it seems like what happens is that Agrippa surrounds themselves with people who are on the reformed side of that fence. And many of Agrippa's closest friends actually go over eventually to becoming Protestants. And I would say that Agrippa himself is often very Protestant sounding. He when you read his letters, I mean, it's difficult to imagine that he would not have jumped over to Protestantism, but ultimately he doesn't. And both sides, in some sense, have tried to claim him that the Catholics say that Agrippa's kind of on their team, and the Protestants seem to think he's on their team, and everyone's tried to sort of claim Agrippa on the what side of the fence he was. The truth of the matter is that Agrippa was on neither side. He had deep pro-reform sympathies. He deeply disliked the clergy. He found the Inquisition intolerable, constantly bothering him. Um, he had a very profound sense of the role of faith in the process of salvation. He was also very attached to the Bible as a means of getting access to that faith. Ultimately, it's faith in the Bible that you'll see in De Incurtitudine that basically Agrippa thinks is the only trustworthy book ever written. And even then, he thinks that the Bible's not totally trustworthy. It's an interesting thing we can talk about later. But you can see him sort of being on both sides of this. He finds the clergy and he finds scholasticism intolerable. He finds scholasticism to be um, basically a waste of time. The only thing he thinks his scholastic philosophy is good for is arguing with heretics. It cannot secure your salvation, and in fact, you can get yourself into a situation where you can become you can lose your faith because scholastic dialectics can't take you back to God. Remember, reason is not what Agrippa really takes all that seriously. For him, it's faith, and technically arguing about a bunch of stuff all day, every day, is not going to reconcile you to God. Faith alone does that. And maybe, he says in some of his letters, maybe it's the case that the scholasticism is good for arguing with heretics, but it's not even that good for that. So he has it kind of in both ways. That there's definitely a proto-Protestant kind of thinking going on in Agrippa, but also Agrippa really holds fast to the church as an institution. I think he has a complicated relationship with the church. I do think that he thinks of the church, or at least the primitive church, right? The primitive church of the days of the patristic and apostolic fathers. That there's a kind of archaic truth inside of the traditions and inside of the sacramental technology of the church that he wants to hold on to, but he thinks the church is having really gotten away from that and really not functioning in the same kind of way that he wanted it to. Now, Agrippa's not alone in wanting a kind of mystical reform of the church. Ludovico Lazzarelli, again, to mention him again, he also wanted a kind of mystical reform of the church along Hermetic lines. I think Agrippa wants to see something similar. But we do know that Agrippa did not like Martin Luther. In fact, he says that if the church weren't so corrupt and so spiritually bankrupt, then it wouldn't cause heretics. And he refers to Martin Luther as a heretic. He says it's the church's fault that it creates these heretics. We can't blame Luther. Luther is a symptom of a kind of spiritual rot within the church. But he thinks that Luther's reforms go too far, that it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So he's kind of a neither nor. He doesn't want to go the direction of the Catholic Church. I wonder what he thought about the sort of the Council of Trent and the Counter Reformation. But at the end of the day, Agrippa would live and die a Catholic. In fact, he would be buried in a Dominican church of all things. Of all the people that bothered him in life, he had the sad fate to be buried among them. So, but he lived and died a Catholic, and his relationship to Catholicism is complicated, as I think it is for most thinking Catholic people. But he was certainly at least somewhat sympathetic to the Reform, but he definitely saw Luther as a heretic, and was quite unimpressed with him. We get to 1519, and one of the big ideas that's emerging in Agrippa's mind at this time is the idea of original sin, because remember, for Agrippa, this whole part of what's driving him is this idea of this mystical reconciliation with God. And so the question is, what exactly is the sin of the original sin? What exactly caused us to fall from this place of previous glory? And he comes out and he says, well, it was sex. Sex is what did it. That Adam and Eve had sexual intercourse, and somehow that was what generated the fall. Now, this idea, people in history had put forward this idea, but this was not an idea popular with the church. The church never accepted this. It still never accepted it. And it's odd just for lots of reasons. But we don't know why Agrippa sort of ultimately landed on that the original sin was sexual intercourse. But that was his argument. It did attract negative attention. It was the case that some priests did not like this and preached against Agrippa, and Agrippa had to defend this book again. But De Peccato on the Original Sin was a book he published in 1519. At the same time, Agrippa is, as I mentioned, he's living among the witch trials. He's living in the areas in which the witch trials will eventually come to become the most lethal in Europe. Germany, as you probably know, was the most lethal area for the witch trials. And Agrippa would find himself, remember, he's sent here as a legate. He's sent here basically as a legal bureaucrat. And it happens that a woman in his jurisdiction is actually arrested and charged with witchcraft. And Agrippa will successfully defend her. Agrippa's beliefs about witchcraft are complicated. In general, it seems that Agrippa mostly thought that the women being arrested were simply senile old women, that they were not, in fact, witches. He does think that witchcraft was real. He does buy into what we would call the modified theory of the elaborated theory of witchcraft, which is to say that the witches were a new type of heresy, that were a fundamentally anti-Christian heresy that was being fired up by the devil. So he did buy into some version of that conspiracy theory. He was not a complete witch skeptic in the way that some other people were, like Balthasar Becker or even his student Johann Weyer, who was a stronger example of a witchcraft skeptic. And so it seems like Agrippa's position is something moderated. He thinks most of the women being arrested are being railroaded, but he does think the threat of witchcraft is real. So again, it's a complicated position that he seems to have. Now, the way that he defends this woman against the charge of witchcraft, remember, he got a law degree at some point. We don't know exactly when he got this law degree, but he did get a law degree. And basically, the way he defends this woman against witchcraft is by making the argument that her rights had been violated by the local inquisitor. Now, the inquisitors were known at that time, witch hunters were known at that time for basically railroading people. They could get you arrested. They could do all kinds of things that violated procedure. And because there was no way that a lawyer would take your case, because if you're convicted, if your client was convicted of witchcraft, you were also convicted of witchcraft. Most of the time, these women had no legal counsel. Many of them were illiterate. Many of them suffered from what we would now recognize as mental health problems. Many of them were very poor. Many of them had probably just never been to big cities before. And so they could just be railroaded and be basically murdered within a week of being accused of witchcraft. So this is what ends up happening is that Agrippa actually argues that the woman's rights had been violated, and that that even the inquisitors had made theologically wrong positions in their trial. Basically what ends up happening is they searched her house without her consent. So you had some basic legal protections even at this time to the rights to privacy. Her things were seized without her consent, and also they actually accused that the accusation of witchcraft that they labeled against her was that she was a witch because her mother was a witch. And there, because her mother was a witch, she had inherited this kind of witchcraft, and that secured her guilt. Agrippa actually argued this was heretical. This was a heretical argument because, of course, you cannot inherit the sins of your parents according to Christianity. We can all inherit the sin, obviously, of Adam, but the idea that because her mother had been a sinner, that she had inherited this sin, this was a patently heretical idea. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that the bishop in charge of the Inquisition drops the charges, and the woman is released. Um, I think she'll be rearrested later, and I think maybe even convicted. But at least temporarily, Agrippa was able to secure the acquittal of a woman, basically on technical grounds. Um, this is an interesting moment. There is a rumor that Agrippa actually wrote a book about witch hunting. There's debate now about whether he did, but there is at least one rumor that he did write a book about witch hunting and how he thought witch hunting was bad and how it should be stopped. But if he did write it, it's lost. But now the going theory is that he did not write it, that it didn't, and it never existed. He intended to write it and didn't. Um, Agrippa's views on witchcraft are going to be important when we get to the future here. One of Agrippa's students is going to be Johannes Weyer, who's going to write De Prestigiis on the trickery of demons, and De Prestigiis Daemonum, on the trickery of demons, is going to go into like 6 editions, and it's going to be the most forceful argument for the dismantling of the witch trials. So much so, by the way, that when Johann Weyer wrote it, the King of England, James the First and Sixth, openly named Johann Weyer um, as basically in league with the devil, because by trying to get people to not believe in witchcraft, he was accelerating the efficacy of the witches. And so, can you imagine having a target put on your back by none less than the King of England? So this was a quite terrible thing for Johann Weyer. But at any rate, it seems like Weyer, as a student of Agrippa, picked up some of Agrippa's skepticism about the existence of this pan-European heresy, and it seems like Weyer even turned it up further than even Agrippa himself did. He's also going to get involved in what is called the Saint Anne controversy. The Saint Anne controversy is just which of the husbands that Saint Anne married at what time, and who did she get pregnant by. There was a debate among the humanists about how exactly Saint Anne got pregnant, and this is a huge thing that broke out. And what ends up happening is that Lefebvre is going to weigh in on this. His position is going to be over and against the traditional one. And basically, Agrippa is going to come to the defense of Lefebvre. And what's going to end up happening is that Lefebvre himself is like, yeah, like, I'm not going to die on this hill. I really don't care about this that much. Like, I published a book about it. People are upset about it. I'm not that concerned about it. And basically, what he tells Agrippa is the same thing that Agrippa was told by Trithemius in 1510. Like, I like that you're really hyped up about this, but you need to calm down. Like, you need to roll it back. Like, you need to be quiet. And like, if you make this a bigger deal than it needs to be, we're both going to get in trouble. And so ultimately, he kind of gets shut down by who at the time was sort of one of his big humanist heroes. Never meet your heroes. And basically, Lefebvre Adapter was like, yeah, Agrippa, I get it. You're hyped up about this whole controversy, but leave it. And he did. Agrippa ultimately would leave it. By 1517, Agrippa is getting pretty tired of Metz. He's sort of just a bureaucrat there. He's really not. I don't think he's finding it terribly intellectually stimulating. And he goes back to Cologne in 1520. Again, this is a constant. At least he goes back to Cologne of his own will. Here, he's not tail between his legs because he's basically being kicked out. But he goes back to Cologne in 1520. And sadly, his wife would die. First wife, his Italian wife, would die in 1521. We don't know much about her, by the way. I don't think we even know her name. But his wife would die in 1521, and he would remarry that same year in Geneva. So I guess he loved her, but he wasn't too upset about it. So he got married again that same year, and that wife would ultimately, I think, end up getting, yeah, he would have a daughter and then 5 sons from that wife. She's going to die shortly as well. So spoiler alerts. But we do know that Agrippa's bloodline lasted all the way into the 17th century, but there's no evidence that any of his children maintained his interest in the occult. It seems to have died with him, although it's a really I don't know, kind of the kind of thing that I don't know, the cool legacy to carry on from your dad, but his kids did not do that. I don't think there are any living descendants of Agrippa now. I think that they all died out, as far as we can tell, in the 17th century. And in Geneva, I should mention here, he's working as a medical doctor. Again, he got a medical degree at some point. We don't know when exactly. And it would be in Geneva, he would first work as a medical doctor. Folks may know that there were cases where he would be the only doctor that would treat people, especially plague victims. Treating plague victims was notoriously dangerous. You could contract the plague, and Agrippa became quite famous for treating plague victims in a big way. We'll see in just a minute. From Geneva, he's going to leave and go over to France in 1524, and this will see Agrippa basically hit rock bottom. France is just a disaster. He just manages to basically do everything wrong in France. It's a total disaster. Um, he got caught criticizing the royal family behind their back in letters. So this is biting the hand that feeds you. He's working for he's trying to get into the court of the King of France, and he criticizes them behind their backs. Um, he writes a book on the sacrament of marriage, which is a bit controversial. Again, we'll come back to some of these works in a couple of more lectures. He writes a book on the sacrament of marriage that is not quite in line with where the church is. The French crown is very close to the church, and this also gets him in trouble. Again, he gets criticized behind his back by priests. He doubles down on this, and he publishes an apology on this text, and this again further just isolates him within the world of the court. Again, the French crown and the church are closely bound up together, and sort of making a religious mistake is just as bad as making a secular one in some ways. The situation gets worse in 1526. The Queen Mother had asked Agrippa to pull up some astrological forecastings about her son, and Agrippa did not. Agrippa had a very complicated belief about astrology. He certainly believed in astrological weather, which is to say, the astral radiation coming down from the stars certainly had an effect and could be captured, and for instance, in the manufacture of things like talismans. But he, in general, had a very low opinion, mostly echoing the position of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, that judicial astrology in general was either impossible because of its complexity, or it didn't work for other reasons, specifically because God sort of vouchsafed human will in a way that protected it from the astrological radiation. And so Agrippa in general was opposed to sort of casting a horoscope for the Queen Mother's son. So there's a philosophical objection that he had, a technical objection he had to doing this. The second reason why he didn't do this, and the truth of the matter is, he did do the horoscope, and the horoscope basically had that the king was the son of the Queen Mother was going to die, and, this goes all the way back to the situation in ancient Rome, where of all the people that you don't want to do an astrological horoscope and it give bad news is for a monarch, because basically you could be accused of treason. In some sense, you were kind of causing it. And by casting the horoscope, Agrippa, like, I'm not going to tell her what it says because I don't want to be basically, accused of killing the king, but also will be king, but also I don't even believe it's true. I just don't think this horoscope is even true because of the way that human free will is protected from astral radiation. So, uh, so what does Agrippa do? he complains about quote unquote astrological superstitions that the Queen Mother has in a letter. Now, you're at court, you're passing letters back and forth. This is a situation where everybody is spying on everybody. Everybody is trying to get dirt on everybody else. And if you can get dirt on people, you can climb the ladder that is their aristocratic system. I'm sure we've all watched movies from this time period where there are just tons of spies and tons of people. At any rate, Agrippa is a kind of the new boy on the new guy on the block. This letter gets intercepted, and it ends up being given to the Queen Mother. Now, it's one thing to criticize the Queen Mother, maybe, behind her back. It's another thing to put it to writing. And he put it to writing. And he basically called her a superstitious idiot and said he wasn't going to do it. So he refused her request and then made fun of her. And she got the letter. This basically what ends up happening is Agrippa just quits getting money. The banker for the banker of the crown just quits writing. Basically, just quits writing him checks, and then Agrippa's like, "I'm going to sue you. Like I can do law." And the banker basically tells him, "Do you know what you're doing? Like, there's a reason why you're not getting paid anymore. Like you're fired, dude. Like you need to leave." And Agrippa's like, "But I want this money. I want my back pay." And the crown banker, right, the coin of the crown is just like, "Listen, man, you're lucky you're not dead. Like, what are you?" Again, he's just woefully naive in some ways. Um, and so eventually he does get the back pay, by the way, and he does leave France. But it even there's even a moment where it's not even clear he can leave France. He's gotten himself in so much crap with the crown that the crown kind of like says, if you want to leave France to go over to Antwerp, which is where he's going to go, you need our permission. And you have to understand that at this time period, when the crown says something like, "Hey, we're not going to pay you and you can't leave," you're about this close to being arrested, right? And Agrippa just complains. He doesn't seem to like he doesn't seem to realize the situation ever. And and he's dejected. You can tell that in his letters, Agrippa seems to suffer from what we I think call now a episode of I don't know, depression. It's good. I mean, maybe it's not depression; it's just despair. Frankly, he's lost his position at the court. He can't leave. He's trapped there with his family, and it's in 1526 that he composes De Vanitate, the major skeptical work. It would ultimately be published a little bit later, but he writes it in the summer of 1526, basically at rock bottom. And there are two ways of going about this. One way of going about the De Vanitate is to say it's just actually Agrippa's honest to God opinion about the world, right? Another way of putting it is this is a man suffering from pretty significant depression, pretty significant despair. He's basically a failure, folks. I mean, if you want to put it in sort of real world terms, he's a failure. He has what, 5 kids. He has a wife. He doesn't have a job, and he doesn't have a job because of his own stupidity at some level, or at least maybe not stupidity, but lack of social graces or something. He has no one to be blamed but himself here. And I don't know about you, but when I felt dejected. The thing that most of us want to do is lash out. And what did Agrippa lash out at? He lashed out at no one knows anything. You guys think you all think you know stuff, but you don't know anything. And the De Vanitate is a lashing out against the possibility of any kind of knowledge. So we'll cover this text a bit more in detail in a couple of weeks, but I just want to point out that De Vanitate, it might be just as much an expression of Agrippa's mindset at that time, of his emotional state, as it is a statement about what he believed. And so again, I think it's very important to know when people write books and what state they're in when they write them, right? When when I don't know, when you see a book where someone's deconstructing all knowledge, the possibility of certain kinds of knowledge, and you come to realize that I don't know, that they wrote that book in the trenches of World War One, which is what the Tractatus was written in the trenches of World War One. You're like, hold on, maybe the Tractatus is a work of trauma, and maybe De Vanitate is also a work of trauma. And so now it's not to say that we should intellectually discount it, but it is to say that it has an emotional and intellectual context in Agrippa's life, and it's basically when he hits rock bottom in France. He does eventually escape from France. I do say escape. He was finally allowed to leave. He was given some of his back pay and then allowed to leave, which I think they say, like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. He does get to Antwerp. He makes his way to Antwerp, and he arrives in Antwerp just in time for the plague to show up and kill his wife. So it's just, it's just terrible, right? It goes from bad to worse. Although at the time at Antwerp, before the plague killed his wife, he seems to have had a good time of it. He seemed to have liked the job. He seemed to have been thriving there. His friends were there. He worked as an imperial historian and archivist there in Antwerp, so he was doing well. In fact, there's a famous story that when the plague came to Antwerp, all the doctors left the city. You have to remember at this time that the plague was thought to be a punishment from God. It wasn't something you could cure, and so because it wasn't something you could cure, all you could do was just escape it or pray. And so, in fact, the scholars at Paris thought that the plague was an astrological alignment. They thought it was just brought on by an astrological alignment. They thought it would last for 2 weeks and go away. It didn't, and they all died. Um, but at any rate, plague comes into Antwerp, and Agrippa is the only doctor to stay in the city. He's treating plague patients, and he's able to nurse some of them back to health, apparently. Unfortunately, not his wife. And when the doctors return, they actually tried to sue Agrippa for practicing medicine without a license. So again, remember, he's working as an archivist, as a historian, and the plague comes in. He's the only one who actually stays. And when they come back, he's like, "Hey, you can't be doing this." So again, you just feel bad for the guy at this point. You get the sense he's a decent, caring person who's trying to do his best to help people, and he gets in trouble for it basically by the doctors guilds. Remember, these doctors have powerful guilds, and they're going to get him in trouble. At any rate, in 1529, he gets royal permission to publish his works, to begin publishing all of his major documents like De Vanitate and On Original Sin and all those texts. And in fact, it would be in 1531 that the first book of the three books of occult philosophy would be published in Antwerp. It's only book one. Now, the book one that gets published in Antwerp in 1531 is identical to the eventual book one that gets published in 1533, nearly identical, but it had a very, very limited print run. And book two and book three never emerged because it seemed like there were pressures on the printers there in Antwerp not to publish it. So, but you can see here, this is the cover of it, right? You can see he's still calling it Siwe de Magia, right? On magic in the first book. This edition is so rare that I've never seen one in real life. I only know of like two of them that exist at all. So it is an incredibly rare edition of the first book of the three books of occult philosophy. He publishes De Vanitate in 1531, and this would earn him the ire of both the priests. So you have the priests, the Dominicans, the Inquisition are pissed off at De Vanitate. But again, who does Agrippa target more than anyone else in De Vanitate? He targets the professors, scholastics. And so he targets them, and at Louvain and at Paris, the doctors of the respective universities there at Louvain and at Paris all write letters condemning Agrippa's book. So now he's getting it from both sides. He's getting it from the Dominican inquisitors, and he's getting it from the academics. And at this point, it's over. There's no chance Agrippa is ever going to get a position at court. His disaster in Paris has ruined that. He's also scandalized the Inquisition again, and he scandalized the academics, which means he will never get a job teaching again either. Remember, he got to the University of Dole. He taught there. He was able to teach at the University of Pavia. There's no chance of it happening now. He's basically now been blockaded from any institution that would allow him to teach, or at court for that matter. Um, he's just stuck now. There's just no chance of him getting a position in court or in the academic world or in the religious world. However, he did write a letter to his biggest hero, Erasmus, at the time, famous Erasmus. We all know the famous humanists. Erasmus had a student of him that was interested in learning the occult philosophy. Erasmus said, I don't know anything about that. And he said, but I know a guy. And he wrote to Agrippa. And it's like, hey, let me put you guys in. It's like, it's like when you email the person who knows about the thing, right? Um, Erasmus reaches out to Agrippa, and Agrippa says, hey, I have a student who wants to learn about the occult philosophy. And Agrippa, they get in touch. Agrippa, of course, continues to write Erasmus. This is meant to be the letter that Erasmus sends him is very polite and very short. Agrippa fires back a letter, right? Just imagine if your hero were to write you a letter, you would write back your life story and how much you love Erasmus. And Erasmus basically says, hey, look, you're kind of radioactive right now. Like you're being canceled. Don't bring me into it. Just don't bring me in. Don't talk about it. Don't, basically he says, don't mention my name. Let's keep this letter on the down low. Basically, don't mention my name. Erasmus already has enough problems on his hands. He doesn't want to get wrapped up with radioactive Cornelius Agrippa. So, again, the third time he's gotten a letter from a hero of his basically saying, tone it down, Agrippa, right? The one lesson that Agrippa seems to have never learned in his life. Agrippa always played it up to 11. This is also the time period where Agrippa's going to go back to Cologne, right? He's going to go back to Cologne. He's been in contact with the Archbishop of Cologne there, Herman van Wied. He actually dedicated the first printing of the 3 books of occult philosophy to Herman van Wied and the 1531 Antwerp edition. The Archbishop of Cologne they've struck up a relationship via letters. They're quite friendly, I would say, and very friendly, in fact. And basically, the Archbishop says, come back to Cologne. I'll give you somewhat of protection and we'll get you a job. So Agrippa moves back to Cologne. And in 1532, he attempts to publish the 3 books of occult philosophy. It seems like the Archbishop wants him to publish it. They're interested in the same thing. And again, the Dominicans immediately intercede. In fact, you can even tell in editions of the 3 books of occult philosophy which edition you have, because it's either before the intercession of the Dominicans or after it. So we know that some parts of it were printed. The Dominicans shut the printing down. And ultimately what ends up happening is that Agrippa will argue, and we do have his argument, it does survive, that he should be allowed to publish the book. Ultimately, what would end up happening was he would be allowed to publish it. The Archbishop was able to basically shut the Dominican inquisitors down. This Archbishop, by the way, Herman van Wied, would himself become Protestant, which shows you what kind of Catholic he is. He's a curious kind of Catholic, a kind of Catholic that is an Archbishop that becomes Protestant. But at any rate, in the summer, July specifically of 1533, the 3 books of occult philosophy are finally printed. They're finally printed. And so this text hits the market, and it is an immediate success. It will get several different editions published afterwards. There's an edition 1555, and there's a few more other ones as well. Now, this is where our knowledge about Agrippa seems to go cold. We know that he goes back to Italy, basically to tout his alchemical knowledge. He's teaching people alchemy, it looks like, in Italy. We don't know anything about what he's doing down there. And then after these are some of the last letters. We know he's in Italy teaching people alchemy. And then the historical record goes cold. As I mentioned, most of what we know about Agrippa's life is primarily taken from the letters that he left behind and the letters his friends had. Those letters all dry up. So we don't really know much about what happens to Agrippa after 1533, 1534. The best thing we have is that Johann Weyer, his student, said that he actually took another wife, that he married another wife and then repudiated her in 1535. This may have been another Italian woman, but we don't know. It's not clear why he repudiated her. He goes back to France, which was he should have just stayed in Italy. Why in the world he would go back to France is no one really understands or wonders about that. It just was a terrible idea. He was ruined in France, but he goes back. We know that he was arrested for some reason, maybe debts. And then we know that his friends basically got him out of jail. Well, we don't know why he was arrested, but it probably wasn't heresy. Otherwise, he'd have been arrested by the Inquisition, but he was arrested by the secular courts, again, probably for debt. And then he dies, we're told, he dies in 1535 at the age of 49. He was surprisingly young. 49 is a young age. We don't know what he died of. We don't think he died a violent death. He think he may have just contracted an illness and died. We don't know. But he dies in France, and he actually be buried in the Dominican Church of all things. The Dominicans who had bothered him his entire life, he is now buried among them. And the church there at Grenoble, we don't know exactly. The church is still there. We don't know where he was buried inside the church, but we know he was buried there in the church. But his grave is lost. No, there's no reason to believe he would have had an elaborate headstone, especially if he were dying, if he were in poverty at the end of his life. There's no good reason to believe that he'd had enough money, frankly, to have maybe anything other than a pauper's burial. So he could have simply been buried in a pauper's grave and a mass grave, and that might be in the long and the short of Cornelius Agrippa. That's the life and times and works in a broad sketch, folks. So, what we're going to turn to next week is we're going to begin looking at the influences of Agrippa. Agrippa is a Renaissance man, and in the literal sense of that term, which is to say, he is a person who reads broadly, he reads pretty deeply. And one of the ways of reconstituting what we know about Agrippa is by what he's reading and what he's studying. And so, what we're going to do starting next time, it'll probably be another 2 lectures that'll take us to do it. We're going to go through the major influences of Agrippa, what it is Agrippa's reading, what is it's giving rise to his thought. And it's going to be the unique combination of the things that he's reading, but ultimately going to trigger, and again, they're not going to make it happen. Agrippa is his own singular genius, but we're going to get a better sense of the intellectual environment that shaped him by looking at a lot of the books that he read. Now, some of them are pretty popular, some of them are pretty famous, some of them are pretty obscure. But it'll be interesting to know, what did he know about Kabbalah? What books of Kabbalah had he read? What books of Hermeticism had he read, et cetera, et cetera. So next week we'll be turning to the influences on Agrippa. I think it'll probably take another couple of lectures to get through that, and then then after that we'll turn specifically to going through the major works that Agrippa wrote, beginning with the 1510 juvenile draft of the 3 books of occult philosophy. So that'll be the path, the path for the next couple of lectures, influences, and then we'll turn to his major works.